So welcome everybody to our webinar with Dr. Naomi Fisher, who is going to talk to us about self-directed learning this evening, self-directed education, I should say. And we have done a webinar before with Naomi, quite a while ago now, wasn't it? Maybe a year ago even.
Yeah, it might have been after my first one came out, maybe.
Yes, I think it probably was. So it's lovely to welcome you back. And thank everybody that's come tonight. Sorry, I'm still letting people in. And thank you for giving up your evening. I know that as it's been so hot, it's probably you're really tired, as are we. So we do have a hard deadline of an hour tonight. I am going to cut this off at 9 o'clock, as I have promised Naomi. And actually, I'm getting quite good. I'm getting quite good at that. So we are going to stop at around 9 o'clock, or maybe exactly 9 o'clock. So without further ado, let me just tell you a very small amount about Autistic Girls Network in case you haven't heard of us. So my name's Kathy and I run Autistic Girls Network, which is a charity that supports autistic girls and their families, and also campaigns for earlier diagnosis, because on average, girls are diagnosed about 6 years later than boys. And I'm sorry to sound really binary about those things. It's just that those are the statistics that we have. Unfortunately, we don't have less binary statistics to work with. So now I'm going to hand over to Naomi, and she can tell you a little bit about herself and about her new book. And then we will have a bit of a conversation together, and I have some questions, and then towards the end we'll start taking questions from everyone here. Well, maybe not everybody, but some of you. Okay, so let me hand over to Naomi.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to see you all, or to see some of your faces. My name's Naomi Fisher. I'm a clinical psychologist and I am the author of a book called Changing Our Mind, which is my first book. And I, as a clinical psychologist, there are three things that I'm really specialist in now. It's trauma, autism, and alternatives to school. Different ways of learning outside school. And those what both of my books are about. So the first book I wrote was Changing Our Minds, which was about self-directed education in general. The next book, which comes out on the 21st of June, is called A Different Way to Learn, Neurodiversity and Self-Directed Education. And it's really, and it was born out of my feeling when I was writing my first book, that more and more I was seeing how many neurodivergent children there were who were being unschooled or who were being educated in a self-directed way. But I didn't see people really talking about that very much. I saw it as it was almost like, at that time, this was a while ago, it was more invisible than I think it is now. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, but of course these children are going to be the ones whose parents find a really different way to help them learn, because they need something really different. So that, and then my book, the new book that's coming out, what I did was I talked to lots of families. So I talked to some professionals, but most of the people I talked to for the book were families. They were families with neurodivergent children and often neurodivergent parents as well. And their stories are in the book, all the way through the book. So in fact, one of the things I might do today is read one of the stories if we've got time. Yeah, so that's me. And if you want to get the book, I can give you a code. Should I tell people about a code now? There's a code called
chat.
Yeah, so there's a code NFisher20, means you can get 20% off the book if you order it from Jessica Kingsley, JKP, directly from the publisher. Also, at the moment, if you haven't read my first book, it's 99p on Kindle. So now is your moment to grab it, because it isn't there, won't be there for that much longer. They do these kind of limited time things on Kindle where it's just like 99p for a while. So now's the time. Yeah. Okay.
NFisher20.
NFisher20, but it doesn't work on Amazon. It's just on JKP, on the Jessica Kingsley Publishers website, directly from them.
Okay. Right. So Naomi, I just wanted to, perhaps for people that haven't heard you speak before, perhaps just tell us about kind of your journey into, you know, how did you get into this little niche, I suppose,
Yes.
that you found yourself in now?
Oh, it's so funny, isn't it, how all these things happen? I mean, when you, how long do you want, Kathy? I could go on all night just about my journey into this. Okay, right. I'll try and keep it quick. Basically, I myself had found school really difficult, but I also moved school a lot. So I went to 11 different schools when growing up. My parents moved around. I moved school each time, which I think left me with a healthy skepticism about the school system. And also, I actually think, looking back, it kind of saved me, because I feel like if I had to go to one school, one secondary school in particular, all the way through, I would have really not, well, in fact, I was also, as well as going to these 11 schools, I was also actually a school refuser 2 different times in my life. One when I was 5 and another when I was about 13 or 14. So I had my own quite difficult school journey, and also my experience of really not thriving at school. Then when I left university, I actually went and did a PhD in autism. And that was before I thought about being a clinical psychologist or anything. It was a very academic PhD. I went and visited hundreds of children. Basically, I did cognitive testing on lots and lots and lots of children. I visited schools for autistic children. So that was kind of where I really started to get interested in autism. Then I went off and trained as a clinical psychologist. And when you train as a clinical psychologist, you train with you have to learn how to work with everyone. So we learned how children, adults, learning disabilities, older adults, you do a whole gamut of everything. And then when I was doing that, I got really interested in trauma. And I think trauma as a psychologist is such an interesting area, because it's an area where psychology is like a kind of cutting edge approach. It's an area where you can make an enormous difference without medication to people. And I specialize in this particular kind of therapy called EMDR. And at the time, my 2 interests, I'd been interested in autism already, but then I got interested in trauma, and that seemed like a really separate thing. You see, I didn't really bring them together until a lot later. Then I had my own children, and it quickly became clear to me that my son in particular was not going to thrive at school. And because of my experience as a clinical psychologist, and because of my own experience at not really thriving at school, but also seeing what can happen to children who don't thrive at school, I just thought, okay, we just won't do that. We'll just skip that for now. We'll keep him out. We'll do something different. And then as I kept him out of school, I think I thought, as many people do, I've got a daughter also 3 years younger. She also didn't go to school. And I think many people think when their children don't go to school, they think, oh, you know, by the time maybe they're 7 or 8, they'll be ready to go to school. They'll have kind of become more like school. And actually what happened was my children became less like school. And by the time they were 7 or 8, it was almost inconceivable that they would go to school, because they were so different. They were learning so differently. And this really interested me as a psychologist, because as psychologists, we learn about child development, we learn about what children do at different stages in their lives. And I was seeing my children, and they were doing things really differently. And I started to think, well, what if a lot of what we think of as standard child development, and we talk about in psychology, is actually child development in the context of school? And we don't talk about that because we assume that every child is at school. You know, when in the psychology papers, they never say every single child was at school, because you just expect that. You go, like, I did that myself when I was doing my PhD. I went into schools to recruit children. That's where I recruited them. So I wasn't going to have any children who were out of school, because I wouldn't have even had access to them. And one of the things I particularly saw, so I got involved with the home education community. I started seeing lots of children, just, because that's what we were doing with my kids. And I started seeing lots of really different developmental pathways. So particularly, I started seeing how quite a lot of children who didn't go to school and who I thought were autistic, they hadn't necessarily been identified as autistic by that point, they started coming to imaginative play much later than other children did. So, the sort of standard, what you would say in child development, in psychology, you'd sort of say imaginative play starts around the age of 2 or 3. There's a really intense period up to like 5 or so. And we encourage imaginative play. Schools encourage, nurseries encourage imaginative play at that time in life. And then children go into school and we stop encouraging imaginative play. We kind of encourage sitting still and listening and that kind of thing. And what I noticed in the children around me and in my own children was that they went through this really intense period of imaginative play when they were like 7, 8, 9, 10. And it was often really different to the early imaginative play that I'd seen in other kids. It was often inspired by Minecraft or that kind of thing. But what I started to think was, wow, maybe something about the wet school is actually restricting children from going through a kind of natural developmental process that we see when they're not in school, if that makes sense. And so that all of that made me really interested. And as I started to get interested, all these things started to come together. And I thought I really have to write about this because I'm so interested in the psychology of learning and particularly for kids who don't thrive at school, particularly for kids for whom school is really difficult, and not necessarily on an academic level, but for kids for whom school is difficult on every other level. So sorry, that's a long and rambling answer.
No, that's okay. And that brings me quite nicely to my next question, actually, which is why can school be such a problem for some neurodivergent children and young people?
Yeah, so I think school has expectations. Right from the start, there are expectations, and those expectations increase as you go through school. So, right from the beginning, it's expected that you'll be toilet trained, for example, by the time you go to nursery, and that you'll be speaking by the time you go to nursery. And then by the time each time you move up a rank in school, it's expected that you'll be able to manage a bit more. And I don't mean really in academic terms. I mean in terms of managing yourself, but also in terms of how much emotional support you get from the adults around you. So in nurseries, teachers or nursery nurses expect to be giving some emotional support to the children in their care. They have key workers, they expect it to be about care as well as about education. And as you go through the school system, it becomes less and less about care, more and more about education. The adults become kind of more distant often. And for some children, for neurodivergent children, that can often happen too quickly because it has there's this kind of standardized expectation. At this age, you will be ready for this. At this age, you will be ready for this. At this age, you'll be ready for this. And if you're not, then you're floundering. And I think particularly the point at which that's really clear is the transition from primary to secondary, that in primary school, most primary schools are smaller. They're mostly a bit more nurturing. You mostly have one teacher with you for the whole day, every day. You're in one classroom. There are fewer transitions. You move to secondary school, suddenly you're expected to transition every hour around the school to a different place. You don't have one teacher who knows you. It might be a different teacher every hour. It's like the rug is pulled out from many children. And it's not about the academic demands particularly, although those get higher too. It's the fact that children are expected to have all these sort of skills in self-management, skills in social skills. And if you are a bit out of sync with what the sort of standardized expectations are, then you suffer, really. And what happens, I think, to young people is that they start to think of themselves as having something wrong. They start to think it's me that's the failing here, not the system. And so I think that kind of thing perpetuates itself. So you have a young person who's maybe, for example, isn't ready to read at the age that other children are ready to read. They see everybody else learning to read, and school is saying, this is the right time to learn to read. You're 6 now, you should learn to read. This child isn't able to. And what they often conclude about themselves is, I'm stupid, I'm worthless. And those kind of things, as a psychologist, that's what really interests me, because those kind of things stay with children. I work with adults as well. I've worked with autistic adults, I've worked with dyslexic adults, I've worked with all sorts of different adults, and they will tell me about their experiences at school. And it won't be about, the fractions or what the academic stuff. It will be about how they felt about themselves at school, and that will stay with them. And often if they felt stupid at school, I'll see them at 42 and they'll still be saying, I feel like I'm no good. I'm no good at maths. I was no good at maths at school. I'm still no good at maths. I still freeze. So I think it's all the demands around the academic work that's so difficult for lots of neurodivergent children.
Yeah, and demands is quite a good topic to bring up there, isn't it? Because obviously, we know that children with a PDA profile, for example, and PDA standing officially for persistent demand for autonomy, don't like that name at all, of course, but you don't have to necessarily have a PDA profile to be quite demand avoidant. And obviously
Absolutely.
A lot of autistic children that we see, or otherwise neurodivergent children that we see, are quite demand avoidant. And of course school is it's just one long
full of
day
demands.
isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. It's hard to have a more demanding environment in terms of expecting you to live up to expectation all the time in school, isn't it? There's no real space to get away. There's nowhere to be able to go and switch off.
No, and contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, just an expectation itself is a demand. It's not just telling someone to do something that's a demand.
No, okay. Exactly.
So next question follows on quite nicely again from that, really. If we're talking about creating an atmosphere which isn't full of demands, what can we do? And leading us into what is
self-directed education. So the way I think of self-directed education is really when we get alongside the child and we find out what really sparks them, what really brings them to life, and we help them to do more of that. So rather than doing what school curriculum does, which says, this is what you need to learn. Now you are 6. These are the things that 6-year-olds must know. These are the things that 7-year-olds must know. You can buy these books on Amazon telling you what your 7-year-old must know. Instead, you get alongside your child and you think, okay, what are they really interested in? What are they really enjoying doing right now? Let's think of ways we can do more on that, or more of that, or think of ways that we can expand on that, maybe. Although the expanding bit is actually the next part. I think for lots of children, particularly if they've had a hard time in school, the first step is just their parent saying, let's do more of Minecraft, or let's play more Plants vs. Zombies, or okay, you're really interested in traffic calming measures. Let's go and see some. So instead of pulling the child away from their interests all the time, we're getting in there with them, and we're sitting next to them and we're saying, let's help you learn about the things that you're really interested in. Because I think that the real nub of self-directed education is the idea that interest drives learning. And the problem that school has, the way I see it, is that when you try and teach a curriculum to children, you have to somehow engage them in that process, because it's not the same as adults being taught a curriculum. You know, if you go, like when I went to study psychology, I went to study psychology because I chose to do that. It's not the same. Children in school are not the same. They haven't had that choice. They haven't been able, they can't choose to be there, and they haven't actually chosen any of what they're learning. So a lot, I think, of the problem of school is how do we persuade children to want to learn what the adults want them to learn? And with self-directed education, we just don't do that. We just don't try and persuade them to learn the things we want them to learn. Instead, we're like, what would you like to learn? And let's do more of that. And we basically trust that through doing that, children are going to see the world around them, and they're going to want to learn the skills they need to participate in the world in the same way as they learn to communicate. They're going to want to learn to do things like reading at some point, because they'll see it's really useful, and that humans have a kind of natural drive to want to learn things that are really useful. But unfortunately, what's often happening in school is we're taking that natural drive away from them because we're trying to make them do things that they're not actually that interested
in. Okay, so when we're talking about self-directed learning and really harnessing their interests, which takes me back to a holiday where we just basically went around looking at aqueducts, actually.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
That was a long holiday. How let's kind of tie that in a little bit with monotropism. And monotropism being, well, monotropism is longer than I'm about to explain it. But monotropism being basically passionate interests, harnessing passionate interests, having that attention tunnel, which is very hard to pull you away from, and also having that inertia where it's difficult to really start anything else. How does that monotropic profile that so many autistic children and young people have, how is that difficult in regular school? And how is that harnessed in self-directed education?
So it's really difficult in regular school, because regular school basically says, okay, I know you're really interested in this thing over here, but what you need to learn is this thing over here. And not just that, as you get older, in fact, even quite early on, I'm going to stop you learning the thing every hour and move you on to something else. So it effectively stops children from ever really getting deep into the learning, because everything is cut up into periods. You might have an hour of literacy and then an hour of numeracy, but also I think the monotropism, really key within it is that it's an internal drive to want to go into that attention tunnel, to kind of get really absorbed in it. It's not really something that one can impose on somebody else. And unfortunately, that is what's happening in school. The learning is imposed upon you by someone else. So basically, when you're doing self-directed education, what you're doing is you are going with the child's strengths rather than going with their weaknesses. I mean, I think this goes for all children, neurodivergent or not. I mean, I think a lot of school plays to children's weaknesses rather than their strengths. You've got young children really, really good at exploring, running around, being active, playing, not so good at sitting still, listening, writing and reading. So what do? We make them sit still and listen and try and get them to read and write. So I think that when you allow children to really follow their interests, and to follow their interests, all day, if that's what they want to do, to kind of fall down that rabbit hole of their interest, and you get in there with them, then the learning can just go in all sorts of directions. But I think the thing is that I think parents often misunderstand, or maybe adults generally misunderstand about self-directed education, is it's not just leaving the child to it. It is helping them. I say there are 3 elements to self-directed education. There's autonomy. So the young person must be able to choose what they do and when they do it, and when they don't want to do it anymore. Then there's relationships. You need available adults or older children, other people who are interested in the child and who are available to do things with the child. And then you need opportunities as well. So that's your aqueducts on holiday. you need somebody, and when the children are younger, it needs to be an adult thinking actively about, okay, I wonder where we could go and see more aqueducts. Or I worked with a man once who was really, really interested in church organs. That was his thing. And we used to go around visiting church organs. But that had to be facilitated for him. He had learning disabilities as well as being autistic, and it wasn't something he was going to be able to do, but he loved it. And it was great. We used to go around and visit all these churches. And in fact, because he lived it was a group home that I was working in where he lived. And because he lived in that area for a while, all the priests at all the churches knew him. So they would all come out and greet him. Then he would ask lots of questions about the organ. And, but he was very directed in that. That was what he was mostly interested in. But he needed other people to keep bringing in things for him to help him continue to learn. Otherwise, children can't do it by themselves, and nor can adults, really. Nor can adults with learning disabilities, certainly.
Yeah. So, what would What would self-directed education look like for neurodivergent families? Let's look at it quite practically as well. What would a day look like?
Oh, well, that's a tricky one, because every day can look different.
Every day is different.
Exactly. But often it might look like playing a lot of video games. But in many neurodivergent families, I know that is what self-directed education looks like. It looks like being together, doing things together, and a lot of those things are video games. Often it kind of divides. So one of the things that we noticed, and one of the things that the families told me about for my book, is that when a child isn't being schooled, that period when they're kind of more in the moment, where they're discovery learners, where they're more play focused, goes on for longer than it does in schooled children. So in fact, for children who never go to school, they're often still entirely play based until they're 10 or 11. That's just, they don't. When I started, I thought that there would be a period where my children would sit down and say, get me a workbook. Never happened. But there was never a period where they kind of seemed to conform to what school was expecting. But then what happens is, as they go through puberty, and this happens at a different rate for all children, they go through puberty and their brains start to mature, their brains start to change, and they become more capable of doing things like thinking about the future. And that the new neurological research shows that this happens over a period of about 25 years, not 25 years, up to the age of 25, from about the age of 10 to about the age of 25. And I think with lots of neurodivergent children, it happens really gradually. But you can see that change. And I talked to families in my book who would say, there's one particular family who's had a 15-year-old autistic son, and she said, it was years of video gaming, and then he got to about 14 and he was like, actually I would like to learn Mandarin Chinese. and Japanese. And he became really focused on learning languages in that way. And then he became really focused on politics and philosophy. And he started kind of learning in quite a different way. And she said, you know, you just wouldn't believe it if you look back and seen a couple of years ago when all he really wanted to do was play video games. So people talk about this quite distinct shift that often happens, and that happens with all kids. But I think it can be harder for families with an autistic child, for example, because they're more worried about it, because people will be saying, well, what if, you know, what if they don't learn these things? Don't you think they've got to have this? Don't you think they've got to have this? It's really hard for families to kind of keep the faith and believe that things will change.
Yeah, and of course, these days as well, it's a little bit harder, isn't it, to home educate, in that you do have, or you may have, a local authority breathing over your shoulder.
Definitely, yes, but autonomous education has been recognised through the courts as a legitimate form of home education. There have been court cases in the past where families have been taken to court and they have established the right to use autonomous education, which is the same as self-directed education. So there is the case history is there, but it's true that it can be tricky to convince the local authority that it's real education, because they're expecting school. They think if you're at home, you should be replicating school at home. And that's very much not what it looks like in any family that I've ever met, really.
Okay. So talking about the families, what struck you when you were interviewing the families for your book?
The thing that really struck me, actually, was what amazing kids they had, but also how much they really turned towards their children's differences and how much they really embrace their differences in a way that I think is really difficult to do at school. So if, say, for example, a child really needed to move all the time, they facilitated that. So I've talked to one family and her 10-year-old just was constantly active, and she had built parkour stuff in the back garden, and she had him going to parkour in the park and trampolining, and his life was based around this drive he had to move all the time. So it was whereas instead, if he was in school, it would have all been, how do we stop him from wanting to move all the time? How do we mitigate this? You know, they might have done things like put in movement breaks, but really they would still be thinking that the learning is going to happen when he's sitting still, so we want him to be sitting still. Whereas with the self-directed families, it would be very much about, okay, so right now he needs to move all the time, let's find ways to do that. So their view of learning was much wider than I think it would be in school. You know, they didn't see learning as something that happened sitting at a desk. And the other thing that I think really stood out was this progression, was the change, and how families would talk about noticing things like, one person talked about her autistic, non-speaking 3-year-old, actually, who was really, really fascinated with textures and with putting sticks along a railing. You know, when you kind of make a stick go along the railing, it goes. So they went around the neighborhood finding railings and sticks to do that on. And there was just something really lovely about how they talked about embracing the things that their children loved, which is really different. When I talk to families whose children have been really struggling at school, they often feel that they need to be pulling their children away from all of these things. You know, we need to be stopping them from doing these things, otherwise they won't be able to succeed at school. So there was a lovely different attitude there.
Yeah, so let's expand on that a little bit. So what can families do if their child is having a lot of problems at school, or maybe, you know, is having difficulty attending school? What can they do? And we know that in some ways, or, you know, it could be seen as a privilege to be able to home educate or use self-directed education. Not everybody can do that. Some people have to, you know, work 3 jobs.
Absolutely.
So, you know,
what can you do?
In all your experience, I know you have a lot of experience talking to neurodivergent families. What have you found are the things that really stand out
that they do in school to help their children in school? So I think with schools, the really key thing is the school able to listen to you? I've noticed such a difference. Some schools just don't seem to be able to take on board what a parent is saying about their child, whereas other schools really do. And I think some schools have policies that compound a child's difficulties. So one family that I often think about had a little boy who's autistic and had ADHD. and he was in awful trouble at school, and he was really unhappy at school, really didn't want to go, was refusing to go to school. And I asked a bit about what was going on, and they said, well, what happens, it's a zero tolerance, they have a class behavior policy at school. If he misbehaves, his name's up on the board, and he gets 3 strikes, then he's outside the head teacher's office. And once he's outside the head teacher's office, that's a strike against the whole class. And if the whole class have any strikes, they don't get their golden time on Friday afternoon. So I said, okay, so what's he getting his name written on the board for? And his mum said he can't stop tapping his pen on the desk. He taps his pen on the desk, it disturbs the other children, he gets his name up on the board, and he just can't stop, he keeps doing it. Because they had a whole class behavior policy, everybody in the class really didn't like this little boy. So they were basically wouldn't play with him in the playground. They were horrible to him because he was the one who meant that they didn't get their golden time every day. So it made perfect sense when she explained this. Well, of course he's refusing to go to school. Who's going to want to go to school in those circumstances? She'd been to the head teacher and said, this is the effect that your policy is having, your behavior policy is having on my child. And they weren't really able to listen. They weren't flexible. So I actually suggested to them that they should try moving school, because I knew, because I worked in the area, that other schools were much more flexible and that other schools were able to listen. And they moved school, and then they came back to see me a few weeks afterwards. I said, oh, how's it going? And she said, it's really good. The first thing they did on the first day, he started tapping his pencil, they got a bit of foam and they wrapped it around. That was it. End of problem. So it's like,
could there be anything easier?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's
and of
stuff
course you
like
can
that
ad infinitum, can't you?
Exactly. So it's stuff like that. Are the school able to work with you on things like that? Because I think there's always a tendency to try and change the child to fit the school. And first, we need to be thinking about how can we change what's happening at school to fit the child. That's number one. The other thing is, if you do have a child who's not happy in school and they have to stay in school, then I would try and make the time outside school really as self-directed as you can. So if you can push back on homework, I would push back on homework. I would say there's no evidence that homework helps children, particularly in primary school. And I don't know what different policies are, but I do know parents who've just said, we will not be doing homework. That is not going to happen here, because they need this time to decompress from school. And then make that time what you can do with it to decompress. So don't perhaps schedule them with lots of other things, lots of other demands. Make it a low demand time. Make it time that maybe you and they sit together and watch YouTube videos together, or you and they sit together and play a game. Try and see if you can build in those connection time with your child, which is on a low demand level. Because I think one of the things that families often tell me about is that when a child's unhappy at school, or when a child's struggling at school, the parents get pulled into it. So, if a child's academically struggling, the parent will be trying to help them do their spellings and will be trying to help them do this. And it means that for the child, it can feel like there's never a space that's not about school, because the parent's about school at home and school is about school. And actually what the child really needs is some time that just isn't about school, because school is really hard for them. So I think of parents, if we can just say, actually, no, this is me as a parent. I am not going to take on that responsibility from school right now. I'm not going to be the person who makes you do this. So I'm not going to be the person who forces you to do these things. I am just your parent, and I'm going to be here with you, and we're going to make this time for us. I think that can help a lot, actually. But it's really hard to do, because schools try to pull parents in. There's research that shows that children do better at school if their parents are supported. So, and the way that schools interpret that is parents do what we want you to do. So yes, but that would be what I would do.
And of course that's why it's so self-directed education is so different to what was happening in the pandemic, when children were at home and parents had to try and make them do their schoolwork.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about there, where parents are pulled into that thing between children and school. It's like parents are kind of a remote outpost of school, meant to be promoting school to the child, even when the child doesn't, is at home. And I've heard of schools saying things to parents like, you mustn't disagree with the school, or you mustn't challenge the school, because that will mean the child will go to school and challenge it. And I just think that's a really kind of insidious thing to say to parents. You cannot be honest about what you think with your child, because that might mean they're more disruptive at school. I feel that's really overstepping the mark when schools start to tell parents what they can say to their children.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we've got some people in here that are thinking about this, but trying to figure out how it would work for them, and trying to, it's a big step, isn't it? Because you are really stepping away from everything that's normal about education. And of course, there will be people thinking about, GCSEs and A-levels, what happens with all of that. Perhaps we could just talk about that for a little bit.
Yes. So
I know how you feel about exams.
Yes, but if you want to, I think that's true. I do have lots of things about them, but there's nothing to stop a self-directed young person from taking exams. The only thing that isn't happening is that they are forced to take exams. So actually what happens with many self-directed young people is that they do enough exams to get them onto the next level when they want to do it. So it's unlikely that they might do 9 GCSEs, because actually you don't need 9 GCSEs to go to college. You just need 5, or even sometimes 4, or even less. Sometimes maths and English is enough to get you on to the next stage. So often what happens is young people will get to a particular point in their life and they'll be like, actually, I'd quite like to go on and do this. And for that, I'm going to need to do maths and English. So I'd like to do it. And then usually there are sorts of different ways that parents do that. Sometimes there'll be small tutor groups locally that parents will get together and pay a tutor to do it. Some parents will do it themselves at home with their young person. Some young people are really self-directed and just kind of do it themselves. There are exam centres. You have to pay, unfortunately. It's a real absolute travesty that there is no funding available. If you take your child out of the school system, zero funding for anything. But it is possible. And often what happens is young people go back into college. So around here, we even have a way that home educated young people can go to college at 14 and just do maths and English. And there quite a lot of colleges have that, I think, now, and that means that you can go to do it for free. But it's not like school, and it's not full time. It's much more, you can drop in and out. And I think lots of young people find that more tolerable than school.
Yeah. We haven't done self-directed education, but my daughter was out of school for about 18 months and then went to a specialist school, and now is at mainstream college because there was no other route for her. And because it's been down this year, but because college is 3 days a week rather than 5 days a week,
all the difference.
Because she is now 18, and if she's not there, I don't have to call and say that she's not there or anything. And because they are much more relaxed about leaving, and or going home if you're feeling ill or any of that, they're generally just treated more as an adult.
More like adults.
It has been okay. Kind of to my surprise, I have to say. It has been okay.
That is amazing. There is a very different attitude. I find it strange. It's like up to 16 there's one attitude towards young people, and after 16 it's almost like, I don't know, it's like it's somehow now it's acceptable not to wear a uniform, for example. Everybody's so up with uniforms up to age 16, and then colleges, it's like you can wear what you want, really. And as you said, you might be able to go for 3 days a week, that's fine. Whereas at school, if you say, could they just come for 3 days a week, everyone behaves as if that's the most horrifying idea. I find it really odd that there's a very, very rigid system between 5 and 16, and then it gets more flexible again.
Yeah, I wonder whether also college generally has more neurodivergent young people, because it tends to be those who don't want to go to a sixth form, who don't want to stay in that very rigid system. My daughter's doing photography, and I would say out of 18 of them, at least half are neurodivergent.
It's going to be young people who haven't necessarily thrived at school as well, isn't it? It's going to be those who want to get away from that school environment.
And it's also young people who perhaps have been to another college before it didn't work out, and they're now at this college. So you've got a really wide age range as well.
Yes, which is
so
great as well. You haven't got these.
If you've missed a year, you don't need,
yes.
which she did. You don't need to worry about that.
I know, isn't it? Again, it's like, why can't we have that kind of flexibility within the school system? Because it's so much obsession about being in the right year group, when actually for lots of children, just being able to be a year later could make all the difference. It's just, I find it bizarre that we've got this obsession with rigidity, very, very rigid system. I think the rigid system causes a lot of problems.
Yes. And ironically, it's autistic people who get accused of being very rigid. Okay, right. So would you like to read your case study?
Yes. So I've got an extract from my book, which is and it's based on an interview with a young person, with an autistic girl who she's got diagnosis of autism and PDA, and I think perhaps ADHD as well. I can't quite remember. Anyway, her name's Chloe. And she is actually a social influencer, and she has a YouTube channel, which is at Chloe Me Just Me. She's made videos for the PDA Society about PDA, so you can go and look her up if you want to. And I talked to her, and I'll let the story stand for itself. Chloe was 14 when I spoke to her with her mother, Tracy. Chloe is a social influencer and has a YouTube channel called at Chloe Me Just Me. There you can see videos of Chloe explaining how she feels when people tell her what to do and how she has to get around her brain. She's fantastically articulate and funny, and a great advocate for a different way of doing things. Chloe started school and tried 2 different schools before the second school suggested that they home educate, a suggestion which Tracy, her mother, says was less of a choice and more like the only option they had left. School was always hard for Chloe, and Tracy says that looking back, she wouldn't have sent her if she'd known there was a choice. Chloe told me about what she remembered of school before she came out when she was 7. It's just constantly being stressed. It's just a new place away from the people you feel safe around. Being someone who's neurodivergent, it's just terrifying. It's been so long, so I can't really remember exactly, because all I can remember now is waking up early in the mornings and feeling the weight and expectation to get ready and go to school. I don't know why school expects you to wake up so early, and then they complain that you don't do homework, like take away my sleep and then complain I'm tired. Chloe was reading and writing before she started school, and she wasn't allowed to read books at her level at school, something else that she found nonsensical. They used to try and stop me from reading certain books, saying, no, you have to read this really easy book because we don't want you getting ahead of the others. They would say, it's not A, B, C, D, it's A, B, Ch. And then a year later, they would say, oh, now it's A, B, C, D. They tell you not to do joined up writing. And then as soon as I learnt that way, they said we had to join up. I thought, well, why didn't you tell me? They undid everything I knew. They would say, oh, no, we need to keep it easy, because if you learn too much, then we can't teach you. Basically, they'd make you completely forget everything you've learned, just hold you back. As soon as I got to the age where I did actually need to know the stuff I used to know, they had to reteach me. It was so counterproductive. Things got really bad for Chloe and her family when she was at school. They told me that she would have instant meltdowns when she left school every day. She remembers complaining about everything and not being able to sleep. She talks about it as offloading her trauma. Her mother said she wouldn't leave the house at all, and it felt as if their house became a prison. Doing anything required enormous amounts of preparation so that Chloe felt safe enough to manage. When Chloe came out of school, things did not improve immediately. Tracy said that she felt it took them about a year before Chloe was ready to start to meet people. They couldn't go anywhere before that, particularly since Tracy doesn't drive, and so they would have had to take the train. Tracy described how they started going out for short walks in the park and how it took a long time for Chloe to realise that she wouldn't have to go back to school and wouldn't be made to do things. Eventually, we did go to a few things, but it had to be no pressure. I'd say, if you don't like it, we'll just leave straight away. And we did that a few times. It helped her realise, okay, if I'm stressed, I can go. If I'm stressed, we can go somewhere else. We can do this, we can sit down, and it will be okay. The difference in Chloe now is dramatic. She says she feels she hasn't been properly stressed for a long time, and she can't remember the last time she had a real meltdown. She'd like parents to know that having PDA doesn't have to mean stress and meltdowns. I sometimes read parent forums and parents say, oh yeah, they cry a lot and have meltdowns. And I want to say, that's not a normal thing. You're doing something wrong. If they're having violent rages when you say things, it's clearly something to do with how you bring it up. It's not enough to say, oh, that's just their nature. Chloe is taking courses in cookery and art, as well as maths and English, and would like to take GCSEs. She still finds that when she's told directly to do something, she feels anxiety, which prevents her from doing the task. She's finding her own ways around this, a process she called looking for loopholes. If I'm given something direct to do, then the anxiety attached will be too crippling and I'll be unable to even try it out. Having options, freedom, or just the safety of knowing I can explore different ways allows me to actually do something. I like to look for the loophole. If they said it has to be a book, I don't see a specific loophole, so I'll just make it bigger or smaller or different. That way I can somehow make it work in my head. Then I'll panic because of time management, and that's my own downfall. I made it way too big and way too extravagant. Tracy said that now that Chloe is older, they are finding that there is more flexibility in the courses that she does. Over time, activities of daily living have become more possible, but Chloe still does them in ways which feel easier for her. Tracy explained, she finds a way around it now rather than refusing or procrastinating, which was pretty well what she did in her younger life. Yeah, she now just goes, okay, so in order to do this thing I want to do, I have to find a way around it. I can imagine it being very taxing and tiresome in her brain, and she needs to find ways that help her feel in control and safe. I hope the environment and the way we help her allows her to do that. Chloe talks about the other ways in which Tracy and she work together to make it possible for her to do things. My mum has found a way that helps me do certain activities by putting a bunch of things out on the table. Then I walk up and I go, what's that? I want to do that. My curiosity always gets the better of me. I know why she's done it, but there's no pressure, just choices of what I can do. I'm going to end there.
Yeah, and their autonomy standing out.
Exactly.
Massively. That's what we need. We need the autonomy. Okay, right. We haven't got very long left, so I'm going to go to some questions. Let me find one. Okay, is a challenge of self-directed or autonomous home education in different families where privilege of being home with your child is not possible? Sorry, that I probably didn't read that right, but if you can make that into a question, what are the alternatives?
What are the alternatives? So there are some places, there are some self-directed learning communities. They are few and far between, but there are some. You can find them. There's a website called progressiveeducation.org where she keeps a list of them. They tend to be part-time. They tend to be 3 days a week because they can't be official schools. That is because of the law, unfortunately, that the schools basically that self-directed education isn't following a curriculum. It doesn't conform with what Ofsted think a school should be doing, and so it's very hard for those schools to be recognised. It's never an easy choice and it's never a convenient choice. When I started doing it, I gave up my dream job to do it, and I started working evenings. And I know quite a lot of home educated parents who's doing that they basically, if they have anybody else who can look after the children, they will work. One of them will work during the day, another one will work evenings and weekends. That is what we did when our children were younger. If you're a single parent, it's even harder. I did have several single parents who interviewed for my book. One of them had moved back in with her parents in order to be able to home educate her boys. It's never easy, and I wish there were more options. I absolutely wish there were. There is more of a community around than you probably think there is. If you look on Facebook under home education in your local area, you will find out what the families in your local area are doing. And some families do get together and do things like share childcare. So they do swap children on different days and that kind of thing. That never really worked out for us. We were never able to do that. But some families do manage that. But it's not an easy choice. Absolutely. It's deeply inconvenient. It's never easy. And it's, the most society is set up to send your child to school. That is how it's set up. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, next question. My 16-year-old daughter burnt out and has been out of school since February, going in for her GCSEs. She's hoping to go to college in September. Do you have any advice for how self-directed learning might apply to this transition for her and others in a similar situation?
So I think the big challenge for young people who are burnt out by school, well, recovery is the first part of it. And that is something where you just need to go as low pressure as possible, really, because that's the only way. And I think in a way, if the more that she can just let the pressure lift, the better things will be. Often there can be a kind of pressure to start preparing for college or start doing things, but actually that low pressure time is really, really crucial, because I think that when you come out of school, I mean, when you're burnt out, there's a long process of recovery, but there's also the process of kind of reconnecting with yourself, that when you're in school, you've often had to kind of conform to the way that school is. You've had all these demands on you for so long. And really, what the sort of, I think, what self-directed education would mean for her at her age would mean spending this time learning about things that she finds interesting rather than things that she thinks she has to do for the college course. So if she's really interested in, you know, making YouTube videos or making podcasts or anything, it would be spending her time following those rabbit holes and sort of letting herself fall down those things, because probably for most of her life she hasn't had the time and space to do that. But I think I have a webinar on burnt out by school, actually, on the recovery process, but I think it's self-directed education can almost become a pressure as well. If a child's really burnt out by school, they just need time to recover, and they need time not to be doing things. They need time when it's just okay just to be for a while. And I would say that as someone who I think I was burnt out by school at one point in my life. I think it just need the sort of pressure to what you're going to do next can stop you from actually getting better.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before about college, if college is her next step, she really doesn't need to worry about the age range or taking a year out, or, you know, whatever it might be. I know you might have the local authority on your back if you haven't deregistered, but that is the age gap, or the age, you know, the year group is not a problem at college. There will be older young people than her at college, so that's, you know, something that's
really useful to know, isn't it? Because young people are often so worried about being out of year or being out of, and it's it's really unhelpful.
Okay, right. Next question. I work for Girl Guiding on a project where we've been exploring the possibility of creating a self-directed learning opportunity to provide girls in partnership with schools, with a particular focus on girls making the primary secondary school transitions. Do you have any key advice for us as we take on this design challenge?
Oh, that is interesting. I guess the thing about any kind of self-directed learning project is that it needs to be what the girls are interested in. And that's, I guess you can think about what girls of that age are interested in, but I think the thing about something that's really self-directed is that it needs to have that kind of open outcome. So what you're doing with self-directed education is you're creating the environment for young people to learn, but you're not creating a curriculum. So you are creating an environment which nurtures intrinsic motivation. And the self-determination theory by it's a social psychology theory by Edward Deitchy and Richard Ryan, which I write about in my book. It talks about how you need three things in order to be for intrinsic motivation to really flourish. You need good relationships, you need a feeling that you can do things and that you can get better at things, and you need autonomy, you need choices. So I would be thinking about that. I'd be thinking maybe there's a great book called Drive, actually, by Daniel Pink, which outlines self-determination theory, and I would read that and have a thought about what you're trying to do, how you could set up an environment so that those girls can really take off and become and sort of reconnect with their curiosity.
Yeah, and it probably needs some big co-production with them, because it's going to have to be led by them, and they're all individuals. So are they going to agree on anything? That might be your issue. Okay, so next question. You might not be able to answer this, Naomi, but I shall say it, and then if anyone knows the answer, put it in the chat. Does anyone know any colleges in Scotland that would take a 14-year-old for maths and English? So if you know the answer, then put it in the chat.
I don't know, but I would be very surprised if there aren't, because they are a lot in England. I would Google home education, your local area, and you will find a Facebook group, and that is where people will know about it.
And if you well, I guess I've only looked at our local college, but on our local college, there is actually at the top menu, there's actually a specific menu item for 14 to 16. So I would look for that as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I've been home educating for 4 years now. My son was recently diagnosed PDA. I've been doing more self-directed learning with him. I've been using fun school journals with my son, which works well for him. It's not actually a question, but I don't know if you know fun schooling journals.
I don't know. But
Okay. Let me just read this before I. Oh, it's long. Okay, that's not a question. Right. I'm autistic. I'm also a new counsellor at a neurodivergent school. Everything you've said I relate to, and most of my students do. I'm wondering if it's possible to have an autonomous education in a group setting. Teachers give me a lot of pushback for asking this of them.
Definitely. I mean, my children go to a self-managed learning centre just down the road from here, where they are self-directed learners in a group setting. And the way it works is that they are not forced to do anything. There are places, you go in there are different rooms where, like, there's a music room, there's an art room, there's different stuff to do, there's a library, there's a computer room. And at the beginning of the day, they have a meeting, they talk about what's going on, and the young people can choose whether to do it or not. And that is how it works. And it's been working. The Self-Managed Learning College in Hove has been running for 25 years successfully. But there's also, there are self-directed learning communities around the UK. They're generally 3 days a week and not a school. But there's also Sands School in Devon, which is a self-directed school. It's a secondary school. And in the US, there are places like Sudbury Valley School, which is a big school. I think it's got over 100 pupils running on a self-directed policy. So it is definitely possible. There, you know, it varies a lot of how people do it. And but I think there are lots. And also when I talk to people, particularly in alternative provision, actually, I sometimes talk to people in alternative provision who are using the principles of self-directed education in their setting without necessarily thinking about it in that way, because it works. It works with young people who are really burnt out and destroyed by the system and who really need something different. And those are often the young people who end up in alternative provision.
And of course, alternative provision tends to be, you know, pretty small, maybe only 30 students at the most. And that's what you can do something like that there, where it's much more difficult in a school of 3,000.
That's true. But there are in Israel is the only country in the world to have government funded, free to attend democratic schools. And they have schools of 400 plus students, which are run on self-directed principles. So there are places. It is possible. Yes, okay. It's just there isn't much drive in the part of government to do these things. So
no. Okay. Right. It is 9 o'clock. So I am going to impose my deadline now, and this is going to be the last question. I do apologise. I know that I can see that there's 24 messages I haven't read, so I know that there's more questions, but we're not going to be able to cover them all. So this question says, this person must be home educating their children in some way. I keep defaulting to national curriculum teaching for my 9-year-old and 6-year-old ODHDers. How can I shake the old habits and become less structured while also making sure they're learning the basic skills? I've met children who have never been supported to learn the basic bits, and it's so difficult for them to get older. How do I strike a balance?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with supporting children to do things. It's when you're making them do it that's a problem. I think that most home educators would support their children to learn, but I think most people know how to do this because we do it with our really young children. Our children who are 2, 3, 4, typically they're really good at self-directed learning. They are, in fact, hard to stop. And generally, parents often really get alongside them with that. So often, if you've got a child who's really into diggers, for example, you'll find that the parents will start to help them explore their interest in diggers. So if your children have interests, the way you would move away from the worksheets is that you'd say, okay, what, you wouldn't necessarily say this to them, you would think it to yourself. You'd think, what are the things they're interested in? How can I help them do more of that? If they're really interested in Lego, where can we go and explore this interest in Lego? If they're really interested in art, where can we do more art? So you're starting with what are their real interests, rather than starting with what do I think they need to know. I know quite a few people have asked about reading and writing. Self-directed children do learn to read and write without it being imposed upon them. That doesn't mean that they're not helped to do so. Of course, it's possible for young people not to learn skills like reading and writing. But if they are in an environment where those things are offered as opportunities all the time, I haven't met a young person who hasn't learnt to read and write, but they have learnt to read and write at very, very variable ages. So Harriet Patterson did a really big piece of research with home educated young people about reading. And she interviewed over 400 families. Or no, it might have been 400 young people, not families, because some families had 2 young people. And she found that home educated young people learnt to read between the ages of about 3 and 14, and that the age they learnt to read didn't then predict their capacity to go on and do further education. So she had one young person who was dyslexic and had ADHD, who didn't learn to read until she was 14 and then went to college at 16. And that's been my experience too, with the children I see around me, and also with my own children, that they've learned things quite a lot later than schooled children do. But when they've learnt it really quickly, and they've been really interested. So my son, for example, didn't do any formal maths until he was about 12, actually, no formal, nothing at all, no work, he's not a worksheet, no workbooks, nothing. And he's now just sitting his maths GCSE, and he's actually doing it a year early because he really loves maths. So he hasn't done any, he's basically had about 3 years since he started studying maths. He's 14 now, about to be 15, and he's doing maths GCSE. So, and I know lots of stories like that, because when children are really interested in something, they can learn things in a different way to that kind of progress that goes on at school.
And that autonomy is so important. If we're talking, so my daughter was diagnosed dyslexic at 17. She's 18 now. We tried to bring it up at all of her mainstream schools since she was, I don't know, since the age of about 6. They all ignored it. This year, she decided, in January the 1st, she decided that she was going to read 100 books. And she is more than halfway through.
Yeah.
And so she has now read more books than she's ever read in her whole life in 2023. Just because she, well, I don't know, the diagnosis.
She decided she wanted to do it.
There was a reason why the numbers and the characters and the words were jumping around the page. And once her brain figured out that there was the reason why that was happening, she was able to deal with it more, and she's really enjoying books. In fact, I've done training all day today, and in my lunch hour I had to take her to Waterstones to buy a new book. So,
wow,
these things change when it's your choice.
And it's really hard. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it, when you see that kind of switch around? It's so amazing to see. You're just like, gosh, is this real? But that's, and we're not doing she's doing self-directed reading. That's entirely she is. She's doing self-directed reading.
She'd already read about 13 books before she told me. She decided to do it. So
that absolutely, that's the essence.
Account.
That's the essence of self-directed learning, though. She decided she wanted to do it. And I think it's having that faith that our young people will set themselves challenges. I think because young children do have a tendency to, they're very much in the moment. They're not particularly great at sticking at things. It would be unlikely for a 6-year-old to say, I'm going to read 100 books. Some might, but most just won't. And so people, I think, they sort of project that forwards. They're like, my goodness, but my 6-year-old won't stick at anything. If I don't make them do it, surely they'll still be the same when they're 16 or 17 or 18. And they forget that actually there's a massive neurological development that goes on between the ages of 6 and 16, enormous change. And that children do start to look around them and go, oh, actually, there's a whole world out there, and I would like to do more of that, or I would like to learn more of that. And if they haven't had that crushed, and I think, unfortunately, what happens for some young people is that gets crushed at school, that kind of spark of wanting to explore the world. And if we can help our kids keep that, or if we can help them get it back, then that's what's going to keep them going. That's what's going to keep them going through life.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, right, that I am going to draw a line under it there. I have put the link to Naomi's new book in
Oh
the
yes.
chat, I think. Yes, I have. And the code in there. So, and also I think Naomi said your first book is on
Yes,
offer
99p on Kindle, 99p
Yeah.
on Kindle. You can buy that one right now. The new one is out in about a week and a half. I have a book launch with Eliza, who illustrated it on Wednesday. You can find me on Eventbrite, and do go and follow me on Facebook if you want to. I'm Dr. Naomi Fisher on Facebook.
And Eliza also illustrated my book. So
Oh yes, Eliza is illustrating all the books.
Yeah, she's doing all autistic related books now.
She absolutely is. Yeah, she's amazing. In fact, look, shall I just share the book cover quickly before I end? Here it is. Look, I was saying I don't actually have the book, unfortunately, but there is the book cover. Can you see that? That's what it looks like. And there's Eliza's illustrations of a child doing some self-directed drawing on the front there.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm sorry everyone who asked a question that we didn't have time to answer. If you follow Naomi on Facebook or Twitter, you might find the answers to those questions, because
you
you're
never
quite
know.
active, aren't you?
I am, and I try to answer questions if people ask. I often find questions sort of spark me off as to writing things as well. So
yeah. Okay, right. Brilliant. Thank you everyone so much for joining us, and thank you, Naomi, for giving up your time. I'm only 8 minutes late. That's
pretty good. You're pretty good. Thank you,
bad.
Kathy, for asking me. It's been lovely to be back here with you all.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.